Thanks for tuning in. Before we start this adventure, I need to tell you that I am not a videographer, much less an editor. I'm largely unfamiliar with editing software, and therefore, should I mispronounce something or even use the wrong word, I humbly beg your indulgence in this regard. Each of us could use a little latitude of judgmental-lessness. This is the story of my life as a sculptor. Although the story goes back a long way, I feel it still has a long way to go. I was born in Chicago in 1951, which makes me an aging baby boomer, complete with inflamed prostate and macular degeneration. At my age, I'm supposed to be seasoned, experienced, and even wise. I was lucky enough, or perhaps even destined, to be born into a family where the father was an architect and who had many fine art books within which I would routinely bury myself as a boy. By the age of 6, I fell in love with the work of Romanian sculptor Constantine Brancusi. My father told me a story about this last piece titled Bird in Space. At the historic 1913 Armory Show, many created works of modern art came streaming into New York City. Each of these had to get past a customs inspection. The custom inspector who uncrated Bird in Space at first refused to let it into the country labeled as a work of art. He was convinced it was a piece of machinery. Later, but still as a young boy, I would discover the work of Henry Moore. And still later, many others. I was 10 years old when I first really knew, that I would be an artist. I didn't know this artist was to be a sculptor until I was a teenager. One evening, my father drove my sister, Christine, and me to Old Town on Chicago's north side. There were no expressways in those days, so we had to take surface streets from 118th and Bell all the way up to North and Wells. This long drive afforded Dad the opportunity to explain where we were going and what we would so soon encounter. Dad explained that there were those creative individuals who had difficulty assimilating into the so-called norms of society. He called them nonconformists, although beatnik would have been a better word. He said they were pretty much all artists, painters, musicians, poets, writers, and sculptors who sought each other out for creative support and encouragement, and lived together in enclaves such as Chicago's Old Town. This neighborhood was close to downtown and, before it got gentrified, was affordable by even a starving artist. What took me years to realize was that by taking us to Old Town, Dad was really showing us the life he secretly craved to live. Years later, he confessed to me that he wished he had never gotten married. He really wanted to go to Cranbrook Academy of the Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, to study sculpture. He even knew the name of the master under which he would have studied. Carl Mills, from Sweden, then chaired the sculpture department, and his bronze castings of beautiful nymphs were usually set in fountains or reflecting pools. Curiously, this last photo, the sisters, is set in a fountain between the two women's colleges at my alma mater, Rice University. We walked around Old Town for a while, and sure enough, it was populated by artsy, craftsy beatnik types, some of the men sporting the obligatory goatee, black turtleneck sweater, sunglasses, and a beret. We went to a coffee house where a street musician, a clarinetist, walked in and started to play. Dad handed me $1 and asked me to request Greensleeves, his favorite song. Remember, this is 1961, when $1 could get you 20 Snickers bars. By the time we got home, I was on fire. Although only 10, I had this deep sense of having found myself. I knew I was to be an artist. I just knew it down to the bottom of my being. From Bell Avenue, our large family moved into an apartment at 108th and Western. By now I'm a teenager at a Jesuit prep school. Our backyard was an asphalt parking lot where a felled American black walnut tree lay for years and years. It was held up off the pavement by its own larger limbs and was therefore sound and seasoned. Although later in life I would become well acquainted with chainsaws. Using a simple carpenter's crosscut saw, I proceeded to cut off a chunk of this walnut tree to carve. This was a lot more difficult than it sounds. The wood was dry and hard, and I picked away at it for weeks before I finally lopped off a chunk that would become my first carving. Actually, it was probably my second true carving, the first being a head whittled out of clear ponderosa pine, which bore an eerie resemblance to a face that would later be discovered on Mars. I lugged my walnut up to my bedroom, which I shared with Brother John. We had a long study desk mounted between two freestanding wardrobes, which served nicely as my sculpting bench. Using only a carpenter's flat chisel and a carpenter's hammer, I began the mysterious process of slowly removing, chip by chip, unwanted material as I approached some unknown inner form calling to be released. The chips were hard and dry and stuck to the carpeted floor. Fortunately, Brother John could sleep through a tank battle. I quickly discovered the addictive nature of carving. I could not stop. I worked late, very late one night before Dad came home. He was often out late at zoning board meetings, after which he would celebrate his victories with his cronies at some South Side drinking establishment. This night, Dad came home just a wee bit into his cups. Hearing the unfamiliar sound of hammer striking chisel, Dad burst into my room. He was actually quite excited, way too excited, about what he saw. He immediately grabbed the tools out of my hand, and for the next half hour, he attacked my precious walnut, having the time of his life, carving big, bulging eyes onto it. Rather than share his excitement, I hated him for this. This was my piece, damn it. It took me weeks just to saw it away from its trunk. Here he was, disfiguring my work, and I was absolutely seething inside. But in those days, I hadn't yet learned the valuable skill of standing up to this bully. Rather, I just quietly let the juggernaut roll right over me. The onlooking angels in my room that night probably saw no crime, but to me this was nothing short of violation. I felt raped. Dad soon tired and went to bed. I spent the rest of the night, clear up to sunrise, undoing his damage. With quick and hateful cuts, I removed his work, carving deeply into my piece. Imagine I was cutting directly into Dad's face with every blow. The piece eventually became mine again that very night. But just when you think you have Dad figured out, he throws you a curveball. The next Saturday morning, he asked me to come with him. He has some errand in mind and he wants me along. Actually, this was quite common. Most of my young education came from following my father around and just watching his magnificent performances. But this Saturday morning was different. Rather than going off to one of his job sites, we wound up at the art supply store on 104th and Western. Here, Dad picked out for me 2 lignum vitae mallets and an entire roll of various carving gouges and chisels. He knew what proper carving tools were and that I had been suffering with carpenter's tools. Just when I couldn't possibly hate the man anymore, Dad pulls this miraculous act of redemption and generosity. Don't sell the guy short, man. By now he must have been fully aware of his crime, having seen all his work disappear from my walnut face. And so it ever was to be. Dad and I would continue to do our love-hate dance for the rest of his life. Father-son angst did not begin with us. It's as old as mythology itself. I attended Rice University, majoring in architecture, although it probably looked like I was majoring in sex and drugs. One evening, at the far end of the campus where the old stadium and the media center were, I had stolen a chunk of teak that was curing under the bleachers of that stadium and carved 3 bizarre heads on its trifurcated trunk. Working on a mattress directly on the floor of an apartment on Rosemont Street, making one heck of a mess and annoying all the downstairs tenants. But while there, as I watched the sun sink behind the old stadium, I had this vision, and I heard this voice. Something undeniable and powerful was going on inside me, and the clear message was, drop out of school, move to Cambridge, and start sculpting. This reminded me of Emmanuel's angelic messenger admonishing the young Jesus, hey kid, don't you think it's time you were about your father's business? There were, back then, only two centers of the universe. One was San Francisco and t'other was Cambridge. Sensing I would not fit into the whole California scene, Cambridge made a lot of sense to me. Although dropping out wasn't easy, the message was so powerful that I did it anyway. There was a war going on somewhere in Southeast Asia, and as long as I was in school, I enjoyed that white boy's privilege, a student draft deferment. Nonetheless, I had drawn a very low draft lottery number, and Uncle Sam now wasted no time in trying to induct me. I had been denied conscientious objector status and was ordered to appear at some huge induction center in Chicago, which I always likened to just another Windy City meatpacking plant. I'll spare you the story of my day at the induction center. Suffice it to say that Providence had different plans for me and stepped in with her kind ministrations and allowed me to gently walk out of there. Although I'm sure that she had helped me out before this was the very first time I became aware of it. So with $200 in my pocket and everything I owned, including my carving tools, stuffed into a pillowcase, I drove to Cambridge the very next day. And now the story really begins. No longer a kid living at home. No longer protected by the ivy-covered walls of a great university. I'm finally out there, in the real world, quite on my own, quite unprepared, quite terrified, but nonetheless quite confidently on a mission. I was particularly and devastatingly quite unprepared for how achingly I would miss the fine lady I left in Texas. You know, young men can be really stupid. We're often blinded by the thrill of the next adventure to the point where we can't see the good things we already have. Being familiar with this neighborhood, having been there before, my first stop was Harvard Yard. I entered the gates and immediately broke into both a desperate panic and a frenzied run. I ran and ran across the yard as hard as I could. This was one of those seminal moments in my life where I'd finally realized that after all the huff and bluster, after all the announcement and expectation, I was finally there, in Cambridge, exactly where I said I was going all along. The terrifying next question was, okay, now what? It reminded me of Ben Braddock having finally captured his Elaine Robinson, sitting in the back of a city bus, quietly, numbly, with those blank expressions on their faces, both thinking, okay, now what? As had been prearranged, I was to stay with a prep school classmate who lived in a carriage house behind Haley House in Chestnut Hill, part of the Boston University campus. While staying there and looking for a place to live in Cambridge, I produced this work, a highly sexually charged, if not confused piece. I laminated the block myself from 2x8s, carved it, sanded it, and stained it. I even built the base with borrowed carpenter's tools. I eventually found a room for rent on Walden Street in the Porter Square neighborhood of Cambridge. Easy walking distance to the old Porter Square Sears store, Harvard Square, and the Cambridge Common. At the Cambridge Common, I commingled with every other hippie in town, openly smoking dope outdoors, dancing to the free music that always seemed to play there. I'd like to tell you I was flourishing, but the truth is, I was starving. I learned how to live for 3 days on $1 worth of food. open-faced peanut butter and sugar sandwiches on white air bread. While living in Cambridge, I learned of subsidized housing for artists, which was soon to open in Boston. The Piano Craft Guild, as it is still called, held over 300 newly converted loft spaces in the former Chickering & Sons Piano Factory on the corner of Tremont and Mass Ave. I applied and got accepted. Finally, I would have proper live-in studio space with tall ceilings and large windows. The building had its own gallery on the lower level. After the initial group show opened to all residents, I had a two-man show. This was the poster announcing that show. I'm the face in the lower left. In a very short time since moving to Cambridge, I had furiously produced 24 works. I was young Michelangelo on fire. Being too poor to buy decent materials, I carved anything I could get my hands on. I carved short lengths of telephone pole that had been removed by the power company and left in the gutter. I carved heavy chunks of limestone, brownstone, and sandstone which I pilfered from building demolition sites. I even carved a discarded marble gravestone. I carved salvaged redwood that my father was going to throw out. I carved cut-off scraps of Douglas fir and southern yellow pine laminated beams. And when I could afford it, I would buy boards from a lumber yard and laminate them together into custom-shaped blocks with clamps of my own design. In 1975, I moved to New Hampshire and got married. One of these was a tragically dumb mistake. In retrospect, I should have stayed in Boston. I had a two-man show under my belt. I was a member of the Boston Visual Artists Union and had participated in one of their group shows. I had wonderful subsidized studio space in a great neighborhood. I was someone to watch. The tragic results of this uprooting to New Hampshire was that it would be 36 years before I would carve again. Flash forward now to 2011. I meet this high-energy Cuban lady, an art student of great talent and drive. She would come to my office and I would show her on the computer the works of Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, Jean Arp, Wilhelm Lembruck, Gustave Vigeland, Marcel Duchamp, Aristide Maillot, Auguste Rodin, Michelangelo. I chose this Michelangelo for a very good reason. If you zoom into the detail shot, the face behind, and this is titled Taking Christ Down from the Cross, the face behind in the hoodie is said to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo himself. If this is the taking down of Christ from the cross, the two other men on the bottom are Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. But historians generally agree the big guy in the back is Michelangelo. This is Bernini's The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Bernini had a drill that nobody else had, and this drill would allow him to get these incredibly intricate undercuts in the folds of the drapery. He could do things nobody else could do because he had a tool. Now you see the arrow in the hand of the cherub. You should interpret this arrow as a phallic symbol. Most art historians will tell you that the ecstasy of St. Teresa is really a sexual climax. Another Bernini. This is Apollo and Daphne and Apollo. Apollo is chasing Daphne for you know what. But the moment he touches her, leaves and twigs sprout from her fingertips and roots grow from her feet. She's turning into a tree. Look how delicate this is. Who could carve leaves like that in marble? Again, this is the guy with the drill. And Donatello. This is Donatello's David. And you should compare this to something you all know in your heads, Michelangelo's David. Michelangelo's David, you see this big, strong specimen male with his huge Florentine hands, the rock still in his sling, which is slung over his shoulder. He's looking dead ahead into the eyes of his enemy, Goliath, before the battle. Here, in Donatello's piece, we have this boyish David. After the battle, his boot is crushing the head, the decapitated head of Goliath. This is after the battle, and there is this serenity on his face, quite strikingly different from Michelangelo's David. And if you think you're going to be an artist and you ignore art history, you are just cutting your own balls off. There is so much out there from which to learn and be inspired. So, the Cubana and I would discuss all these things. I showed her things she had never seen before. And then the totally unexpected happened. She invited me to her studio. She hands me this chunk of pottery plaster that someone else had started carving. Then she gave me a half-inch carpenter's chisel. This was the result. I called it the birth of a galaxy. I threw myself on my knees, sobbing openly, praying a prayer of thanksgiving for having been allowed to do this again. Since then, my prayer has ever been, may the works of my hands give glory to you. Not at all unlike the Jesuit mantra, Ad Maiorem Dei Gloria. It was as if a dam had burst within me. With great passion, gratitude, and speed that baffled even me, I produced the following works. The womb. Yeshua. Mother Spirit. Front and back. Tenskwatawa, or some say Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet. Akhenaten, or as history calls him, Akhenaten, the pharaoh, the historical father of King Tut. Here you see him in the original hand-carved plaster with a hand-toned finish. Excuse me. Here he is in bronze. The monitor during sleep. I'm not going to explain this piece, but there's a lot here. This is the front, a detail shot. An incredibly ingenious photograph of the front and the back taken into a mirror. And the back. The Legend of Lorelei. If you know the Legend of Lorelei, you will be able to decipher this piece. Flames of Faith. Louisa. Salonia. Tisak. The Visitor. White on White. the resurrected Christ. Darwin meets Escher. Here's the front, there's the back. The wave. The smile. Here's the front, there's the back. Atargatis was a Persian god who threw herself into the sea and she emerges as a mermaid. There's the front and the back. Caligostia, after Hines. I have to say after Hines because I'm emulating the work of another sculptor. Untitled abstract. The front, which is curvilinear, played against the juxtaposed geometry of rectilinear in the back. There's a detail shot. The finger in the moon. The name comes from an old Buddhist lesson. Odalisque. Whose backside is just as saucy as her front side. The Daughters of Bilites. This is not finished, but with a little imagination, you should figure out what's going on here. Steampunk Harlequin. A triptych. Life, death, and resurrection. Except the piece on the right, resurrection, is unfinished. Its background color will be a cornflower blue. And I would hate like hell to be forced into selling these in pieces. Breaking up the set, I want them to remain together. But you never know. Sometimes you just might need to eat. Reclining figure. This is a new material for me, a composite I've been working on for years. It's proprietary, it's my own. I call it Iron Spot Limestone. Hadron. Front, Hadron, back. I took 2 months off from carving and executed a series of direct castings using Lego blocks as the molds. This is Rothko. Another shot. This is Fibonacci. Here I actually left little Legos in the casting. This one's called Corners. This is Corners 2. This is Rothko 2. These are circles. It's sort of an experiment. I wanted to see if I could get curvilinear forms using rectilinear Lego blocks. This is Sakara. This is Tsunami. And that's my story up until today, 13th of December, 2015. I have dared to expose my humanity to you in a quite unabashed way. Remember, art strives for perfection, while the artist is nothing but imperfection. You'd all love to have a Van Gogh hanging on your wall, but you'd go absolutely bananas if he moved in with you to stay. A gentle caution to all you parents. If your sons and daughters have that passion in their eyes and that fire in their bellies, Don't squash their dreams, even though their dreams might seem reckless to you. Encourage them all you can. Allow them the personal freedom of making their own mistakes and therefore learning their own valuable lessons. Never try to shortcut this process. If their passion is genuine, the true artist will create at any cost, will prevail against all odds. You will never be able to stop it. At the very least, just stay the hell out of their way. Thank you for watching.